Will you join me in our call to worship? We are a justice-making, truth-seeking people.
We gather as a community of believers and seekers.
We share a reverence for the mystery of life.
We are building the beloved community.
Come, let us worship together.
Good morning, Birmingham Unitarian Church.
Good morning.
It is good to be together again. Whether you are here joining us in the sanctuary, remotely via Zoom, or watching this recording later, it is good to connect with you. As a multi-platform church, it is important to build a bridge between online and in-person participants. We're calling this opportunity Greeting Our Virtual Neighbors. First, we will project the image of folks who are currently on Zoom up here and ask them to turn on their cameras and give us a wave. Now, since this is not the camera itself, we have to turn around and look at the camera over there and wave. Yay! Whenever and however we connect with BUC, we are building BUC. At home, on campus, in the world, every day, we are Birmingham Unitarian Church, and we are building the beloved community. We join with other Unitarian Universalists around the world as we light our chalice. Feel the warmth of this beautiful day and the warmth of the love of those around us. May we who are gathered in beloved community be filled with hope, love, and renewal for this Easter Sunday.
Will you please rise in body and or spirit and join in our first hymn this morning? It's number 276 in the gray hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition. If you'd like to follow along there, lyrics will be up ahead as well. Number 276, O Young and Fearless Prophet.
Happy Easter. Unitarian Universalism honors the truth found in all religions, and today's a celebration that centers our Christian heritage. There are many religious traditions that celebrate holy days and festivals in the spring. This includes Passover, Ramadan, Ostara, and others. Unitarian Universalism is influenced by all of these traditions, or can be, but as the direct descendants of Christianity, we have a particular relationship with Easter. Not always an easy relationship, but a particular one. It's like the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, where we know those are our roots, and we also know that we chose to leave for a reason. Easter is complicated, but maybe that's the point. Wrestling with a complicated story is how we build our theological muscles, after all. And sometimes the best way to know what we believe is to give fair and true consideration to something that we find challenging. So here we are. And also, it is okay to be grateful that it's spring. That's okay too. And with that in mind, we'll begin our time for all ages.
It wasn't a particularly hard winter, but it was a long and dreary and colorless one. No wonder then that when the first winds of March, can we have some winds? There we go. By the way, this is an interactive story. The first winds of March blew warm breath across the land, and the land began to green. The wild creatures on 4 feet and on the wing took notice. The first creature, a little brown mouse, there's our mouse, sat back on her haunches and smelled the warm air. She knew what this meant. The green time was coming, and the first small shoots of grass, which tasted so very good, would begin to show themselves. Ah, sighed the little brown mouse. Tender grass to nibble on and to line my nest for my babies. The little brown mouse was not the only creature glad to smell the spring air. The fuzzy-tailed squirrel scampered to and fro, up and down the trees. He paused a moment to watch a sparrow. There, I heard some really good sparrows coming over here. A sparrow and her mate were working on their nest. The sparrows lined the nest with tufts of dry vegetation and tender, fresh grasses. Off in the distance, the daffodils were nodding in the breeze. Where are my daffodils? I see some already out here, nice and yellow. Nice. The fuzzy-tailed squirrel shook his tail and scampered off. He remembered a spot where he had hidden a particularly juicy horse chestnut. He hoped that the little brown mouse had not found it. Overhead, a nighthawk. Is anyone? Pretty close. A nighthawk surveyed the land. His favorite tree was still there, and his neighbor, the fuzzy-tailed squirrel, was there too. He spends his winters far to the south, but he was always glad to return home. The trees were all fuzzy and green with baby leaves, and the flowering trees were bright with colored petals. And over there, the daffodils waving and nodding. The warm spring sun shone upon the land. Let's all reach and stretch out over our land like the sun. Upon the grass that glowed green with vigor, upon the little brown mouse as she put the finishing touches on her nest, and upon the daffodils too. The sun gave warmth to the wings of the nighthawk as, as he soared upon the wind and beamed upon the sparrow family as they worked on their nest. The sun gleamed upon the fuzzy-tailed squirrel as he scampered about. It even glittered upon the pond far below. Down in the deep quiet of the pond, what are some pond noises? Yeah, there we go. Where the water never quite froze, even in deep midwinter, the warmth of the sun began to heat the water until suddenly the frogs. Those frogs, they started to pop up out of their winter mud nests. Tadpoles, now I can't think of a sound that tadpoles make. I don't think so either, but I think they're moving around, right? So let's see all of our tadpoles moving in the pond. Well, they began to swim in the sun-warmed pond, and they dreamed of jumping high into the air to see the grass at the edge of their world. The spring peepers, they joined the chorus as well, and the pond added music to the colors of spring. And there, in the musical, colorful world, where the grass was green and the daffodils nodded, in the breeze, where the tadpoles dreamed and swam in the warm waters of the pond, where the frogs bellowed, and the peepers, they peeped, where the fuzzy-tailed squirrels, oh, that was really good. They were really scampering in the trees, and the nighthawk, that nighthawk settled into his tree. The little brown mouse snuggled up with her babies in their cozy little nest. The sparrows, they sang excitedly together as they waited for their eggs to hatch. A symphony of life renewed by the warmth of the sun for all to hear, carried upon the wind. You might even be hearing this music right now. Well, maybe not quite from outside. So can we then create that symphony here together? Everyone, make some noise, move your body as we welcome spring. Awesome. Fantastic. This was a beautiful symphony, which we may even hear our fellow wild creatures making outside later today. We are having an egg hunt, and so you're invited to join us in the courtyard after the service. Everyone's invited to come in and see the fun things that are going to happen. But at this time, our K through 5th graders are going to meet us at the back of the sanctuary to head off to class.
The mission of Birmingham Unitarian Church is to be a free and welcoming religious community that encourages lives of integrity, learning, service, and joy. One way we live out this mission is by giving half of our weekly offering to a nonprofit organization that shares our values and addresses needs in one of these areas: environmental action, income equality, civic engagement, and racial justice. We support a new organization each month. The plate share recipient for the month of April is Relief Michigan, the only statewide nonprofit tree planting organization that works with Michigan communities and organizations to protect and restore our urban and rural tree canopies. Its mission is to educate the public on the value of trees and how to properly select, plant, and maintain them. Each year, Michigan continues to lose valuable tree canopy due to development, old age, storms, which we know of now recently, and invasive insects and disease. Yet on average, only 1 of every 4 trees lost is replaced. Since 1988, Relief Michigan has partnered with more than 650 communities across the state to plant more than 32,000 trees on public property in Michigan's cities, towns, townships, and villages. Let there be an offering in support of our beloved community and organizations that build the world we dream about. This morning's offering will be received with gratitude. Ushers, please come forward. church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. With gratitude, we dedicate this offering to the good works of our congregation and dedicate ourselves to its service.
We come to the time in our service that we set aside for spiritual practices of centering and prayer. We begin with a sharing of joys and sorrows. This week we have one sorrow from Christine, no last name. I could have a potentially very serious health problem and could potentially lose my health insurance. Please pray that my health improves and that I'm able to afford my health insurance. Also, I ask for a prayer that an angel comes into my life for friendship and emotional support. This morning also, I think many of us are concerned about the ongoing conflict in Israel and Palestine during a time of year when we spend a considerable amount of time talking about and thinking about that part of the world. It is a challenging, seemingly intractable problem that breaks our hearts. I invite you now to move with me further into a spirit of prayer or centering. We call upon sources of wisdom and strength, the mystery of life that is known by many names and by no name at all. And on Easter Sunday, may we also say, most gracious and loving God. We are a people who want so desperately for the world to be different. We see things that could be different. Sometimes that feels sad or heavy, to know that there's a gap between what we want and what is. Hidden in that is optimism. There is a possibility where it seems that there is none. What we see is a potential. The fact that we know that it's there means that we believe it must be possible. Give us strength and guidance as we continue on the way of finding more truth, more justice, more beauty, more hope, more love in this world. Give us strength to continue on together. Give us guidance that we may do so in peace and harmony with one another and with the world around us. Give us love beyond reason. Give us passion beyond all sense. Help us to be that Easter people, even when we may not be totally sure what that means. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be. I'll invite us now into a time of shared silence together.
Our first reading today is by Mary Oliver, titled Spring. And here is the serpent again, dragging himself out from his nest of darkness, his cave under the black rocks, his winter death. He slides over pine needles, he loops around the bunches of rising grass, looking for the sun. Well, who doesn't want the sun after a long winter? I step aside, he feels the air with his sharp tongue. Around the bones of his body, he moves like oil. Downhill he goes toward the mirror of the black pond. Last night it was so cold I woke and went out to stand in the yard, and there was no moon. So I just stood there inside the jaw of nothing. An owl cried in the distance. I thought of Jesus, how he crouched in the dark for 2 nights, then floated back above the horizon.
You know, Teresa, I think there might be 2 last lines to that poem, if I'm not mistaken. There are 2 more lines. It is, there are some questions more beautiful than stories. I think the trouble is that I told you to use that reading, and I forgot to tell you there's 3 different poems by Mary Oliver called Spring. That's probably what happened. I'm sorry. I should have just entered the text. I'm sorry. That's probably my fault. Well, you know, when you're going to talk about something tough in a UU church, you got to bring in Mary Oliver, right? Because nobody can fight about Mary Oliver, which tees us up to read from the Gospel according to Mark. Now, I actually have never read the Easter narrative in this sanctuary, and this is my 5th year here. So I don't know when the last time was anybody heard it read aloud, but it's worth visiting every now and again. And this year we're going to use Mark 16, verses 1 through 8. Now again, as I mentioned last week, Mark is the oldest gospel, which means the language is tough. It's weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's choppy. Also, in the gospel according to Mark, the oldest, the most original version of the story, there are 3 different endings. Today we're going to end with the original, which stops at verse 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they may anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Lovely are the
So this week, as I did with last week, I want to make it really clear while we're dealing directly with an explicitly Christian text in churches that try to be very pluralistic. 3 reasons. Although we are not a Christian church, Unitarian Universalism is the descendant of 2 Christian denominations. Secondly, Unitarian Universalists affirm the truth found in all religions. Christianity is a religion. Third, the Easter story has cultural resonance in the United States, and therefore it's grist for the mill of Unitarian Universalism. We need to talk about what this means to us, because we live in a country where it is all around us. As a pluralistic religion, UUs are called to wrestle with sacred stories of all kinds, even the ones that are confusing and emotionally charged. We are not expected to come up with the same answer, but there is value in struggling with these questions. And I want you to hear me today and every day when I say the whole point of Unitarian Universalism is that we do not have to agree. One person's truth does not diminish another person's truth. In fact, holding competing truths is a healthy exercise that can bring better clarity to personal belief. Years ago, when I was in divinity school, everyone was required to take a class that would make us confront multiple truths, because not everybody was a UU. And even the UUs are not always good at it. The class involved submersion in another culture. The idea was to get out of our comfort zones, physically, emotionally, intellectually, just really push us. The class that I took was about interfaith religious education, or religious education in interfaith settings in Israel. As we traveled across that troubled nation, we learned about the deep and insidious cultural divides and how some are working hard to heal those divides through interfaith religious education. It was a humbling, challenging, and transformative experience. Nobody likes to learn that they didn't know what they thought they knew, and that's what that class was for. While we were still in Jerusalem, we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is believed by some to be the burial site of Jesus. This is where the Catholic, Orthodox, and a few other traditions teach that Jesus was buried. And the next day, we went to the Garden Tomb, where Protestant tradition holds that Jesus was buried. This presented a crisis of faith to some of my classmates who were from Christian traditions that interpret the Bible literally. Also, nobody told us that's how we were going to do it, so it was a surprise. And so one of those guys that was there with me from one of these literal traditions asked the tour guide, "But which one is the real one?" And she looked at him with a wry grin, and she said, "Oh, I think you know more about that than me." She was Israeli, right? So, yeah. And I found her response to be endearing and frankly gracious, given that she was a Jewish woman who was probably tired of Christians asking her for help fortifying their faith. However, I thought I was smart and smug, and I turned around and I looked at my classmate, and he was devastated in a way I wasn't ready to see. And it really broke my heart. Not finding the certainty that he needed was really, really hard for him. If the Easter story is literal for you, you have a place in this church. If this is a meaningful story that can provide wisdom and strength, you have a place in this church. If you are so sick of this story, you don't like it, you're tired of it, and you just wish that you were at brunch, you also have a place in this church. We do not have to agree. That's the whole point. Wherever you are on that spectrum, as we approach the sacred stories of the world's religious traditions, let us summon a reverence and a humility to remember that we are standing on somebody's sacred ground, even if it's not yours. And may we have the wisdom to remember that something does not have to be true in order to be real. Analyzing the text The actual text of the account of the Easter story found in the Gospel according to Mark can be a surprising and an illuminating experience. It's tough, it's short, it's gritty, it ends abruptly with everybody at loose ends. Only 8 verses, no appearance of the risen Jesus. And I don't think that I'm alone in reading this and going, what? And some of that is cultural influence, where I'm used to a version of the story that's very complete. It goes a certain way. It ends with this clear mandate to the disciples, and I imagine there's a trumpet playing in the background, because that's the story we've been given in this country, and yet what appears in the oldest, most undecorated account of the events is very, very different. Mark's account leaves us wondering. And maybe that's the whole point. There is some scholarship that suggests that the structure and language of the text indicates the story is meant to be a parable. That is the suggestion of Marcus Borg and John Crossan, whose work on Palm Sunday we used last week. A parable is a teaching story, a common tool in oral literary traditions where this comes from. Jesus used parables all the time, often relying heavily on irony and other literary devices that would upend the listener's expectations. Because when we go, wait, what? Why? It makes us keep thinking about the story, driving the point deeper into our hearts and our minds. What do you mean the angel commanded the women to tell others and they just didn't? Obviously, they told somebody. It's a literary device that keeps the story with us long after we've heard it. And again, commonly found in parables. A similar literary device is when a story has 2 endings. We wonder, why does this story have 2 endings? And we wind up turning the story over and over again. The most common example of this is The Lord of the Rings. There's like 17 endings. Why? We are left to reconcile the differences between those endings. And our attention is meant to be drawn most strongly toward the second ending. The story of Jesus' last week, as found in the Gospels, certainly meets this criteria as well. The execution of Jesus would have been the expected end of the story, but it's not. There's a second ending. It would be a very different story if it ended with the execution of Jesus. That would be a cautionary tale about why it's better to accept your lot in life and not cause any trouble. And remember, the context of this story is brutal oppression of the Jewish people under the hands of the Roman Empire. The heart of the story is that age-old unsolvable riddle of how humans organize ourselves. We touched on this last week. Throughout our history, and presumably before, we have shown ourselves incredibly adept at creating systems that put power in the hands of a few while excluding the many. We create a system, the system dissolves, a new system forms, it is dissolved, and onward we go. They all eventually do the same thing: power for the few, oppression for the many, and then an overthrow. Taking that Hegelian perspective to the story, we can understand that Jesus was the sociological antithesis of the Roman Empire's values and methods. They were a violent, oppressive regime that prized order and obedience. The Pax Romana, the peace that the Romans brought to the world, was no peace at all. It was a stranglehold. And it gave rise to the teachings of Jesus. They created a rebel who gave the oppressed a vision of a different world, one that was ruled not by might, but by justice and love. A place where people thrown out or thrown down by the Roman Empire would share in a peaceful, equitable power structure where the first would be last and the last would be first. Thesis, might is right, Roman Empire. Antithesis, right is right, Jesus. And under these conditions, it is narratively obvious that the only logical outcome of the conflict between these philosophies is the execution of Jesus. A violent, oppressive regime would, of course, rid themselves of a troublesome rabble-rouser out in the hinterland by means of a gruesome public death. And that is the expected end of the story, the cautionary tale. But then, we are presented with an unexpected second ending, a reversal, a resurrection, no less. Maybe a literal resurrection, but most certainly a narrative one. The Roman Empire thought they had put an end to this talk of a new world, these ideas, but what they did by crucifying Jesus was they made that story explode across the ancient Near East. Out of the despair of imperial occupation, a triumph, a story that lived on. Out of nothingness, the potential for everything. From that end, a new beginning, different than before, but somehow not. As Cross and Borg have pointed out, nobody is troubled by the veracity of a parable. We don't need to know if there really was a good Samaritan who helped a Jewish man that had been beaten and robbed. Nobody says, oh yeah, well, what was his name, and where did he live, and how far were they from this alleged inn? Because we understand that the point of a parable is to learn something. We don't get hung up on those details, exact events. We're moved, we're changed by having heard the story. And that's enough. When we get caught up on literal resurrection, we miss the forest for the trees. We risk missing the point altogether. Every narrative device in the Easter story points to the very, very end. And the very end is about the women. The text tells us they're walking to the grave, trying to figure out how they're going to roll the stone away. They want to embalm Jesus' body and give him the respect and the dignity that they felt he deserved. I have seen a gravestone that is a replica of what would have been in use at the time. They're huge, much taller than me, about a half a foot deep, solid stone, round. And remember, ancient people were much smaller than us. It is impossible that these women could have moved that stone. They knew that. But they went there anyway. They had already bought the spices, and they were determined that they were going to do what they thought was right. These were women who had known and loved Jesus. They wanted to offer a final act of service to someone who had meant so much to them, someone who had treated them with respect and dignity, who had given them hope in those brutal times. And it didn't matter that they didn't know how they were going to do it. They were going to get it done. They were determined to do it. And then another surprise. The text ends with them not doing what they're supposed to do. The rich irony of this. The original manuscripts end with them leaving in terror and not saying a word to anyone. There are additional endings in the Gospel according to Mark. There's a total of 3. They were written later, presumably to clarify and help make sense of what happened, maybe integrate some of the other Gospels that were out. But the original oldest account of what happened, of what is the most important part of the story, is an ironic cliffhanger. Obviously, they told somebody. But the text leaves it unsaid. Why? To make us think about it. To hold our attention and to make sure that this story, this complicated, beautiful, important story would make it out of the realm of peasants living in ancient Palestine. 2 endings, irony, cliffhanger. This story is bundled up in a little arc of literary devices that would carry it to lands unimaginable to the people who wrote it and survive the ages. Of course, there is a durability to this story that goes beyond its literary and narrative genius. What that is, though, is something that each of us must determine for ourselves. This story is like a kaleidoscope. We might all be looking at the same thing, but we're each going to see something different here. Given that every narrative element of this story points to the very, very end, though, I offer up to you this year a consideration of doing an impossible task. Knowing that you can't do it, but being determined to do it anyway. And then the possibility of not getting it done, and it turned out better than if you had done it the way you meant to. That's the journey that these women were on. They went to the tomb, fully prepared for the possibility of failure, found out the body was gone, did not spread the word, and ignited a major religious movement. We've all done something impossible in our lives. I'm willing to take that bet. Each of us has had a moment that required more than we had to give. And looking back, maybe we're not sure how we did it. We just did. This Eastertide finds us surrounded by impossibilities. I think that's been the case for every Easter that has ever come before. And I have a sense that it'll probably happen again next year. But life calls us ever onward. There are plenty of things that we can't do to make our lives and our world a better place. That is no reason to stop trying to do them. This world has always been something impossible, a massive, unmovable stone. And yet, in this world, in this life, everything is possible. If we show up and we try it anyway. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.
Please rise in body or spirit and sing our closing hymn for this morning Easter service. It's number 61, Lo, the Earth Awakes Again. Change then mourning into praise. Alleluia. And for dirges and palms praise. Alleluia. Our spirits soar and sing. Alleluia. Hearts weep with us
Go now into this world as a beacon of hope and joy. Go in love, go in peace. Now that our worship has ended, our service begins. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.